everyone, welcome to lesson 1.7. As we are going through, again, remember to fill out your guided notes, or you can print them, you can type in them. Just make sure to write down your notes. And for this lesson, we do have a lot of new vocabulary, so it is highly suggested to highlight or mark those terms as we go through. Okay, so niche kind of depends on where you live. You can say it many different ways. I'm probably going to change up the way I say it throughout this lesson, but I'm going to start with niche. So a niche is the range of physical and biological conditions in which a species lives and the way the species obtains the resources it needs to survive and reproduce. So looking here kind of at this graph, the range of external conditions that a species can survive and reproduce is called the range of tolerance here. A species' tolerance range helps determine its habitat or the general place where it lives. At the center is this optimum range, and organisms are most likely to be found here in this optimum range. They become more rare in zones of stress, which is down here, your lower limit and your upper limits of factors. Now for our community interactions, we're going to talk about quite a few different interactions today. The first one is competition. So when organisms attempt to use the same limited ecological resource in the same place at the same time, competition is going to naturally occur. Direct competition between a species is always going to produce a winner and a loser, and the losing species will die out. There is two types of competition, intra and inter-specific. Intra, you can think of being within, right? It's competition among members of the same species. Inter is competition among members of two different species. The competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy exactly the same niche and exactly the same habitat at exactly the same time. And if two species attempt to do so, one will be better at competing for the limited resources and will eventually exclude the other species. Now go ahead and examine this diagram to the right. Okay, it shows two species of Paramecium, which is a single-cell protist, and they are grown in different conditions. What happens when they are grown together? And how does this demonstrate the competitive exclusion principle? So here, the bold line is together, the dotted line is alone. So whenever they are dotted, or they're both alone, you can see that they both survive, thrive, and grow as normal. Whenever they are together, or the two solid lines, you have one that thrives. The other one, unfortunately, dies out because of that competitive exclusion principle. For dividing resources, the exclusion principle explains why we rarely find species in natural communities with overlapping niches. So competition creates pressure for each of the species to specialize the way they want to use those resources. And by causing species to divide resources, competition is going to help determine the number and what kinds of species in a community and the niche each species occupies. So looking at this diagram below, how does this diagram show resource sharing? What would happen if the two warbler species tried to occupy the same niche in the same tree at the same time? So right here, it's showing resource sharing because they're all sharing the same tree, but they each have their own section of the tree. That is the only reason why all three of these can survive, is because they have adapted over time to feed at different parts of the tree. So our next community interactions, predation, herbivory, and a keystone species. So among organisms in food webs, those interchangeable relationships can vary over time. Okay, interactions between predators, prey, and between herbivores and plants are very important in shaping communities. So for predation, that is the interaction when a predator feeds on prey. Predators can affect the size of prey populations in a community, and they can determine the places prey can live and feed. Herbivory is the interaction in which an herbivore feeds on a producer. Herbivores affect both the size and distribution of plant populations in a community, and they determine the places that certain plants can survive and grow. Sometimes the effect of a single species on community structure is so important that it changes in its population can impact the structure and stability of an entire ecosystem. That is known as the keystone species, which is a single species that is vital to ecosystem stability. So kind of pause here, think to yourself, what is an example of a keystone species? So one example that you hear about in the media a lot are bees, right? Bees are a keystone species. They are a pollinator and they are vital to many different ecosystem stabilities. Now we're going to get to community interactions, also known as symbiosis. So symbiosis is the relationship in which two species live close together. Biologists, we recognize three main types of symbiotic relationships. So we have mutualism, and that's whenever both species benefit. So you may have heard this term before, and if you're thinking in terms of like emojis, that would be if you have two happy faces, okay? Commensalism is the relationship in which one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So for emojis, that would be like one happy face and one just like meh face. And the last one is parasitism, and that is the relationship in which one organism lives inside or another and it harms it. So that would be one happy face and one sad face. So on your notes, you're going to write out two examples of each type of symbiotic relationship. So two examples of mutualism, to commensalism, to parasitism. So you can pause here and you can do a little bit of research to find two examples of each. Okay, so after you have found your symbiosis examples, you're also going to pause here and you're going to watch this video, which is linked in Blend, and answer the questions. Okay, now that you have watched the video, you should have your answers down in your notes. Okay, so for our check for understanding, you're examining the two graphs and you're going to explain the difference between the predator-prey relationship, which is this graph on the right, and the competitive exclusion principle, which is this graph on the left. Okay, so pause here and try to answer that by yourself. All right, so the biggest difference here is for competitive exclusion principle, you're going to see one species here eventually win out and this other species will die. Okay, so this one is the dead one, this one won. Okay, now for predator-prey relationships, it's more of like a cyclical type deal. So if the prey population rises, you're going to see the predator population also rise. But as this one goes down, then you will also notice that the predator also goes down. So the predator is usually lagging just a little bit behind on that prey population, okay? And this is also going to continue to increase and decrease just depending on the predator-prey relationship. Whereas for this one, this species clearly won, this species clearly did not win. So changing gears a little bit, we're going to talk about ecological succession. So this is the series of predictable change that occurs in a community over time. Ecosystems, they change over time, especially after disturbances, as new species move in, populations change, and some species die out. So there are two types of succession that you need to know. First one is primary succession, and that occurs in an area in which no trace of a previous community is present. This type of succession does require a pioneer species, and pioneer species is the first to colonize a barren area. So kind of think to yourself, what is an example of a pioneer species? So one example is lichen. You may have heard that term before, but lichen is actually a type of fungus and it can colonize barren rock. Okay, secondary succession. It occurs in an area where that was only partially destroyed by a disturbance. So for this check for understanding, you're going to look at the primary succession here, top photo, and secondary succession here, bottom photo, and you're going to compare and contrast these two photos. Okay, another thing that you can do is if you're still not really understanding succession, you can go into Blend and watch this quick 2-minute video on types and then come back and compare and contrast. So pause here and they will review it in just a moment. So the top photo, primary succession, you notice it has to start with barren rock. Okay, so barren rock here, and then you can kind of start to see some green things. That's probably the lichen, the pioneer species. And then over time, you do get back to full ecosystem stability. Okay, secondary succession starts with soil, right? So we start with soil here, and then eventually you notice they end up looking about the same. Okay, so they're going to end up looking the same once finished. Now, the other thing to notice is the amount of time primary succession takes. So here, this one says 115 plus years. Down here, this says 40 plus years. Okay, so primary succession tends to take a lot more time. All right, now we are on our exit ticket. Go ahead, pause here, and answer these in your notes. So to check yourself, number one, because it began with barren rock, that indicates that was primary succession. Number two, because you started with soil, okay, that indicates secondary succession. And number three, what is the physical component that's present in secondary succession but not in primary succession? And that is soil. So if soil is present, that will be secondary succession. So that is all for lesson 1.7. Again, contact us with any questions, and thank you for listening.